Welcome to the Alaska Mold Stories podcast, sponsored by Alaska Mold Dog, with your hostess, Miss Jennifer Kindred.
This is the Alaska Mold Story podcast, and today we have the opportunity to hear from Emily Gable, her incredible journey. She's just a great advocate for information and truthfulness when it comes to mold in Alaska buildings. And so she came on, and we're going to have her share her story. And so welcome, Emily. Thank you for being here today. And being willing to share.
Thanks for having me on, Jennifer. I've never told my story in any kind of public setting before, and feeling a little jittery, but this is a good opportunity, and it's definitely been something that's on my heart to share with other people. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for being brave and being here, because there's a lot of people, I believe, who are sitting on the sidelines or in the background that have stories that they wish they could share. And it seems like every time we talk with anybody or they hear these stories, it resonates with them. They either know somebody or something connects. And so the more we're able to share our stories, get the word out there, I think it will bring some clarity to people and maybe some understanding. And in the end, we're hoping for healing.
Right.
So welcome.
Yes. I think there's a lot of weird things that happen with mold that sometimes don't even click for you when you're in the middle of that. And then if somebody else shares that, it can trigger something. You can go, maybe there is some connection here. But yeah, so my family and I have been walking the mold journey for about a decade now. I've been married for, 12 years? I think it's 12 years. And my husband and I have two little girls. We have a close to 11-year-old and a girl who just turned 5. And our mold story began when we decided to move into our first 2-bedroom apartment. This was in Juneau, Alaska. We had been living in an apartment that was about 436 square feet. And it was lovely. It overlooked the bay and everything. But every night we had to pick up our baby and carry her out to a pack and play in the living room so we could all sleep. And so we decided it's time for a 2-bedroom apartment. But housing is very expensive in Juneau. And when we told our landlord that we were looking and we were going to end our lease, he said, hey, or I should say the property manager was a man at the time. He said, hey, I've got this apartment over here that's empty. Why don't you come and have a look at it? It's only $1,200 a month, which was a steal then. Actually, I think it was $1,200 minus utilities. So we went over and looked at it, and I had mold in the back of my mind as a concern at the time. I didn't really know much about it. I had this vague idea that it could make you sick. And of course, I was concerned about my baby. But the apartment looked nice and fresh, and I could tell there was some fresh paint and new carpeting, and everything was dry. But I noticed some spots on the walls that looked like scuffs. And I noticed that the window frames looked pretty worn. And so I asked about those. I said, is that evidence of mold? And so, oh, no, that's just where there's been repainting due to wear and tear and repeated painting. And it didn't really occur to me to ask why there had been repeated painting in a specific spot on the walls. So we moved in at the beginning of June, and it was probably a matter of weeks till when I started experiencing symptoms. The very first thing I remember is this sort of carpal tunnel-like feeling in my left hand. And so I did what you're supposed to do when you have carpal tunnel, and I just rested it. I stopped typing. I was careful when I was washing dishes. I stopped playing piano, etc. And it just got worse, and it spread from my wrist up to my elbow, and then pretty soon up my shoulder, at which point it was alarming. And then all of a sudden it was all the way up to my eyebrows and down to my toes on my left side, very left-sided thing. And at this point, I was barely 30. And, consider myself invincible. And I came from a family where you don't go to the doctor, you just deal with it. So I wasn't going to freak out. I didn't have enough of a medical background to worry about things like nerve damage or something going on with my brain very much. So I went to the chiropractor, and that helped a little bit, but it kind of stuck around. And then about 6 weeks after we moved in, I went to bed one night and I was laying there, and all of a sudden I just felt nauseous. And I had this sudden and overwhelming sense of doom. And people who are familiar with allergic disorders will recognize that as a life-threatening anaphylactic reaction. And it didn't dawn on me because, I don't have allergies. I didn't have allergies, and nobody in my family had any kind of anaphylactic disorder. And then all of a sudden I just felt heat racing up my body. And so I flipped on the light and I said, Jared, look at my arms, look at my face. Cause I was covered in hives and I'd never experienced anything like that. So of course it was anaphylaxis. I went to the emergency room and they did not know what to do with me. And they said, oh, well, follow up with an allergist, and it's probably something you ate and you need to figure out what that is. And, that did not yield any answers. And then I had another anaphylactic attack about 2 weeks later, which was very similar. And, the extent of their help was, see an allergist, and you probably need some EpiPens, and here's some Benadryl. But from that point onwards, things just deteriorated rapidly. And I often say there wasn't a single place in my body that I could point to that wasn't affected in some way. My hair was falling out, my eyebrows were falling out. I had bone pain and joint pain, muscle pain. I became so fatigued that I had to pull myself arm over arm up the banister to get to our second-story apartment. And then there was the insomnia. I could be as tired as I'd ever been, go to bed at 8 o'clock in the evening, and I'd come awake at 10:30, just wide awake. And then I wouldn't be able to sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning. And, going to the doctor or my nurse practitioner at the time, everybody said, try these herbs, take some melatonin. And people who've been through mold insomnia know none of that even touches it. Not even a little. Nothing worked. So I was getting about 4 hours of sleep a night. I had a baby, so I'd struggle through the night. I'd fall asleep maybe 3 in the morning, and then 4 hours later or so, she'd wake up. I have to get going, and I would often just fall asleep on the living room floor at about 10 in the morning. It was very challenging to look after my daughter at that time. Boy, what else? I was having intense neuropathy. If I did get out of bed in the morning, I would have to hold onto the wall to make sure I didn't lose my balance because I couldn't feel my feet after a night of laying down. I was swollen up. I was constantly resizing my ring. I had no energy. There were a couple times when we went hiking where I literally thought I was having a heart attack because all of a sudden my heart rate would spike, and I would just feel this overwhelming sense of like something bad is about to happen. And in retrospect, I think that was probably some form of anaphylaxis. So I realized that all of these things were happening in what I described to myself as a flare pattern. And the word flare triggered my memory of autoimmunity, because I had heard about that years before. So I started looking to see if I had an autoimmune disease. And I asked my nurse practitioner at the time to test me for those. And so we looked for arthritis because I had joint pain. And then we looked for Hashimoto's, which was her preference. I didn't know much about Hashimoto's. But, there's hundreds of autoimmune diseases, so where do you start? But the Hashimoto's came back positive. And so I thought to myself, this is the answer. At last I have an answer, and this is what I need to focus on. And I remember her telling me on the phone at the time, like, I don't think this is the problem for you, but it's a place to start. And I was like, oh, whatever. It's given me a target to shoot at. So I massively cleaned up my diet. I looked into the AIP protocol. I, cut out gluten and grains and dairy and, most things except for whole foods, vegetables, and meat. And I think I kept eggs for most of that time, but I was without them for a while. And I immediately felt so much better. I had been having panic attacks, which I'd never had before, and which were terrifying. And the last panic attack I had during that time was the last day I had a piece of bread, a piece of gluten. Gluten was a pretty powerful driver for damage to my body at that time. So I thought that was the answer. And I thought I need to keep on whittling down into these root causes. and figuring out, what's wrong with my body and getting it detoxed. At the same time this was happening, we had started to notice in the very humid Juneau summers that there was some mold growing on the windowsills, and it was really bad. I was looking back at these pictures the other day to refresh my memory, and it looks like it's almost like a skim of ice on the windowsills, or frost. It's just this white fuzz all over from top to bottom. And what that tells me, of course, now is that the windows were not sealed. There was moisture constantly getting through. And that was just the very least of the problems that building had. There was one day when we realized we could hear ravens calling outside from the bathroom because the ducting had become dislocated from the bathroom fan, and it was just open air. There was just a hole to the outside there through the attic. Our toilet was so sweaty that we had to constantly be mopping it down all day, and there was a puddle forming underneath. And we would take all these issues to the landlord, and they'd send in a plumber, or they'd send in somebody to fix the ducting over the bathroom fan. We got a new dehumidifier, and that made a little bit of a difference. It made it so that the humidity wasn't 85%, but was 65%, a big difference, right? And of course, you and I know that anything over 50% is going to grow mold at some point. The point is, we could have made it rain in that apartment if we had wanted to. If we just added a little more moisture to the air, we could have made it rain. It was so humid. And somewhere along there, I started to notice that spot that had been repainted in my daughter's bedroom had some fuzz growing out of the walls, and it was behind the furniture and stuff. And my daughter was starting to experience things like night terrors. She would sleepwalk. She would climb out of her crib, and we would find her in the corner fighting to get out. And nothing we could do would bring her out of that. We couldn't wake her up. We couldn't contain her. We just had to keep her safe and wait for her to wake up. It was really terrifying. And at the same time, she was starting to do this gasping tic. She would go around gasping like, and it was so startling and pronounced that people would stop me in the grocery store to ask if she was okay. And, we'd taken her to the pediatrician, and they couldn't find anything wrong with her lungs. So they told me it's a tic and she will grow out of it. But I didn't connect this to the feeling I had, where if I was laying down and a blanket across my face, I felt like I was drowning. It would fill me with utter panic. It's dyspnea. That's the name of the medical condition that's going on there. It's where your brain feels starved of oxygen, and that happens in mold. So she and I were experiencing the same thing, but I didn't put that together until after we moved. So we started trying to get the mold dealt with in our apartment. And I was still very much of the mindset that, you have to be tough. Don't be a delicate snowflake. Clean it away. Don't be a bother to other people. Don't be expensive. And so I tried everything. I tried bleach. I tried concrobium. I tried essential oils. I tried any other number of things. Every mold product that was out there I tried. And it kept on coming back. And it kept on getting worse. And finally, our landlord paid for what they termed a mold remediation, which was a janitor with a weed sprayer full of heavy-powered bleach. And he sprayed our entire apartment. Yeah. And as you can guess, that it whitened things for a while. It did away with the enzymatic staining. But after a while, it came back more powerful than before. And I started to find it in new areas. And so we started to complain. I was looking back at my emails the other day because I wanted to be fair to our property manager and landlord. I didn't, like my husband said, sometimes you kind of engage in this game of telephone with yourself about your past experiences, and they take on a slightly different flavor. And I think our property manager did what she knew to do, which wasn't enough, but she thought she was doing the right thing, and she was being very prompt about it. But I had to become more persistent. And what they did is they did the bleach treatment, and then they came and they cut that drywall out of my daughter's room. And after every single one of these treatments, my health was starting to regress again. I'd tried the GAPS diet, and that had made me much worse because of all the histamine in the diet. And so it got to the point where I was waking up like 5 times a night with my face swollen, which I now know was anaphylaxis. I was having idiopathic anaphylaxis up to 5 times a night, just from my own body chemistry. And I knew for a fact it wasn't due to anything I was eating as an allergic trigger because I had whittled down my diet so much. I knew everything I ate was something I tolerated. It didn't matter what I took out. And, we know that that is due to a person's histamine bucket constantly overflowing. That histamine dumps into your body and it triggers an allergic type response. And that doesn't get better until you take away the sources of histamine, which can be anything. Your body produces histamine in response to waking up in the morning and in response to nightly circadian rhythms. And your body produces a ton of histamine in the presence of mold. So we were at this point thinking seriously about leaving. My husband was reluctant to jump on board with the mold train. And I think that's a very common thing. Men frequently have a hard time understanding just how detrimental it is because usually they're not the ones experiencing it. And unfortunately, I think our culture has a penchant to view women as being hypochondriacs. And women are more susceptible to illness and to sickness from mold because we have estrogen, because we have cycles. Testosterone is an antioxidant and it is protective. So my husband wasn't experiencing a lot of symptoms at that point. He had some, but he was muscling through them. He was not ready to get rid of all our stuff. And I was reading about mold. What else do you do at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep? And I really did not want to jump down that hole because I could see other people going through it. And I saw that it was just terrible. I didn't want to believe that was our case, but I didn't know what else to do at that point. I'd changed my diet. I had put in all these supplements and it wasn't good. And at the same time, mold really messes with your judgment. And as I'm complaining to our landlord about this, they kept offering to bring in more high-powered bleach. And they had this new spray and pray method called the Goldmore method. And they said, well, this is going to change it. This is going to take care of all of it down to the root level. And I was so confused at that point. I was thinking, what if this makes this apartment the safest place in Juneau because it will have been treated this way? What if we go somewhere else that has mold and it's even worse? It was the mold hold. How do you move on? But we finally got to the point of telling our landlord, this is causing medical problems, we think, and we would like to be out. And so they said, all right, we'll let you out a few months early from your lease. We want you to prorate your payment to make up for what we don't make in money while we're fixing the problem, and we're going to fix it. Because they had finally brought in an inspector, and he was actually an energy inspector. He wasn't a certified mold inspector, but he knew enough to come in there and look at the room, and he told me I wouldn't let my granddaughter sleep in here. This entire fourplex is probably covered in mold on the inside of the wall, and you can see where it's breaking through the studs up here, here, and here. It's ghosting on the studs, because the insulation was uneven. So there were pockets of condensation all over the wall behind the drywall. So we took our stuff and we paid a fee, and we moved into a different apartment. And there was an instantaneous change for me. My immune system calmed down a little, but we had taken our stuff. And, when you do that, your things are contaminated with traces of spores and bust up dried mycelium and the mycotoxins from the mold. And that, in the end, is almost as bad as the growing mold itself. So we had all that. What really changed things for us was I'm still trying to uncover what's going on with my health. And I was getting all this testing done. I took a trip to Anchorage for lab tests that I couldn't get done locally. I paid about $5,000 out of pocket for tests. And then my plane couldn't make it out because of bad weather, which is, of course, a frequent occurrence in Alaska. And I was terrified because I needed Benadryl to sleep at night. And I'd finally figured out that I needed Benadryl actually to prevent anaphylaxis. This one time when I had my throat close on me, I had nearly lost the ability to breathe because I was, just too much histamine that night. And so from that point on, I was carrying EpiPens with me constantly and taking Benadryl. So there I am in a hotel room thinking I need to take Benadryl to keep myself safe and to be able to sleep. But my husband isn't here to wake me up in the morning so I can make my plane at 6. How am I going to handle this? But all of a sudden at 9:30 at night, I was terribly sleepy. And that hadn't happened for me in years. And so I just decided to try it, and I slept, and then I woke up the next morning, time for my plane. And then the plane overheaded Juneau and landed in Sitka. And I was in Sitka for 2 days, and the same thing happened. I could sleep well, and not only that, the food that I had to eat while on the road didn't bother me. It didn't set off my itchiness or my histamine symptoms. And at the same time, this naturopath I was working with in Washington, who had me do a real-time test, a mycotoxin analysis, got the results back to me, and I was very high for trichothecenes and ochratoxin, Aspergillus flavus. No, not flavus, it was just Aspergillus, aflatoxin, that's what I'm trying to say, and others. And the results said these labs are highly abnormal. You need to follow up. So I called my husband and told him about that, and told him about how I was sleeping well and able to eat things. And he said that changed things for him. And when I finally got back to Juneau and walked in our apartment, within 20 minutes, I was itching all over. And so I called him again at work, and he said, that's it, we're moving and we're getting rid of our stuff. So we started to look for a house to buy, because we knew the chances of finding a good apartment were pretty slim. You know, there's a joke in Juneau about how most apartments are rented by slumlords. They are in terrible shape. They're often moldy. They're poorly maintained. You know, we had to fight our landlord just to get screens on the windows to keep the spiders out that kept coming in to bite my daughter. So we started looking for a house, and with the help of our amazing realtor, I think we walked through about 30, and none of them would have worked. We went under contract for 2, and we did the mold tests on those. You know, we did ERMEs, and we inspected them more deeply, and they had bad ERMEs. And so we finally decided to do a new build. And we didn't have a lot of ability to choose who we were going to build with or what it was going to be like, because, you know, beggars can't be choosers. And we were working under an AHFC new home buyer bracket, so we just did not have a large down payment or a lot of say. But we had an amazing builder, and he did an excellent job, and he honored our strange requests. You know, so typically they would have dried in the building for a few days with fans and dehumidifiers, because it's Juneau. It's very damp. He dried it in for a full week for us. He moisture metered every single stud in that house. We had encapsulation in the crawl space. Everything was handled very well. And we finally closed on that house in right before Christmas. And we moved in with almost nothing. We got rid of almost everything we owned. And I had to do most of the moving myself, because our mortgage company was delaying the closing. And so that Christmas, we had a little tiny tree that we took in from the hillside next door. And we just had lights on it. We had no presents except for the ones that relatives sent our daughter. And those almost didn't make it until Christmas Eve. And we each had 2 outfits and a couple blankets and pillows on our mattresses. And we sat on the floor. And that was just great. And within the first 2 days of moving there, I could sleep through the night. And I cried from joy, because it was such a different feeling. And after that, it was like my body could finally breathe. And I started going through what's called intensification, where your body is trying so hard to shed all the toxicity of the mold. I hadn't been able to sweat before for years. You know, your body shuts down your immune system to try to protect you when you're in mold. And all of a sudden, my body realized, like, this is my chance to clean house. So I would wake up every morning just drenched in sweat. I'm sorry, it's really gross, and I started to feel better. I started to be able to do things like go hiking and go walking without getting absolutely winded. It was incredible and magical. It was, you know, the first time we'd had a break in a very long time. And I went from having to sit on our steps at night for a few hours, you know, just holding my EpiPen, waiting to see if I was going to go into anaphylaxis, and, you know, redosing myself at 2 a.m. to make sure I would make it till morning, to just being able to sleep for, you know, 10 hours at a time. There's just nothing like sleep, and it is torturous to do without it. So then we really wanted to have a baby again, and we had lost our second baby while living in mold. And so I was working with doctors and with good nurse practitioners to try to get my body back on track. And I had a clean heart trained naturopath I was working with in Washington on the mold. And in retrospect, I look back and I realize the treatment I went through was not sufficient. But still, I was eager to save money and I was eager to not have to do too much, I think. And I felt guilty for being sick. I felt guilty for, putting my family through so much. So I concluded I was well, but there was a nasty surprise lurking. So I had my youngest daughter, Marin, and I had about 9 months of blissful postpartum. It was a lot easier than it had been with my first daughter. And I'm just incredibly thankful to God for that, because it was such a gift after everything we'd been through and before everything we're about to go through. But eventually I realized I had a breast lump, and I had already had it examined. I had bleeding from my nipple at one point after a traumatic injury there. And I was told, don't follow up on this. I was literally told, don't follow up on this. This is just ductal ectasia from mastitis. It's going to be fine. And they had done a sample, and I have no idea what would cause a doctor to say, don't follow up on this. But that's always terrible advice. I think people should never listen to that. I think I was so relieved by that, and by being out of the thick of disease, I wanted that to be true. But of course, it did turn out to be cancer. It was breast cancer. And so I was told that I had cancer while holding my 9-month-old baby in my arms. And I was told that it had probably been growing for a few years. So it started growing while we were living in our moldy apartment, most likely. And there's no way to prove that, but it takes years for a tumor to get that big. Cancer for me is a whole other story that I could do a whole other podcast on. So I will keep it brief, but the long and short of it is I went through the surgery. I was very reluctant to do conventional surgery, conventional treatments. And my surgery was greatly delayed because our insurance company wouldn't give us accurate information. And then they started refusing to approve the surgeon that I had asked them before if this person was in network, and they wouldn't work with us. So I had 6 months of delay in my surgery. And I always tell people now, once you have a biopsy, get a surgery done within 2 weeks. You have time to wait before the biopsy to decide what your course of treatment is going to be. But once you have that biopsy, you start a clock. And it is known that your risk of metastasis goes way up after that. So after my surgery, I was told I was a stage 1 or 2 cancer patient, and these were my options, and I was going to be fine. And and I just had this feeling that there was something more I had to do. So I sought out lots of different opinions, and ultimately I ended up selecting an oncologist who was in Seattle, who did something called low-dose metronomic chemotherapy. He was one of 3 people in the nation who did that. And he insisted on me having a PET scan. And the long and short of it is we found out that it had metastasized. I had a tumor inside my spine, and that made me officially a stage 4 patient. But he said, and in that moment, I felt like I was in the middle of a hurricane. And then I felt it was like God's hand just snatched me and held me still and said, nothing has changed. I haven't changed. And so I asked my doctor, how long do I have with this? And he said, no, my goal is for you to be healed. And I think we can do that. And it's very rare that you're going to be able to find an oncologist who will say those words to you. Cancer is very difficult to handle. And there are no guarantees, but stage 4 is curable. I've known many stage 4 patients who have been cured for 15, 20, even more years. And that was what my oncologist was interested in. He wasn't interested in just giving you a better quality of life or extending your time, although certainly those things are good too. He wanted people to be cleared of cancer. During that time, we decided, we had discovered that there was mold in our crawl space in our new Juno house. And it was just a byproduct of humidity from the ground, because it's about 85% humidity in the air out there. So we had, there were no remediators in town. There were no inspectors in town who were properly certified and knowledgeable. So we learned how to do the remediation ourselves. And we, to the best of our ability, we followed the IICRC guidelines. We contained the area, we sanded the mold. My husband did this. We removed all the insulation, we removed the encapsulation, and then we small particle cleaned our whole house. And this was actually before my cancer diagnosis, but it was never perfect after that. And when you have mold in a house, it's just never going to be perfect again, because those tiny little fragments get in between the sill plates and the joists and all those things. And if you are highly, highly sensitive, just that little bit of remaining dried out dead mold is going to continue to make you sick. And lucky me, I'm very sensitive. So at that point, that fact, along with the fact that it was just difficult to live our lives in a town that had so much mold in public buildings, we decided it was time to move on. And so we moved up here to the Mat-Su, where it's very dry by comparison. And we'd already visited many times, and we had found in general, there was just less mold in the community. And you'd see these extraordinary things, like people having their buildings with, just plywood on the side of the building and is sitting out in the elements, and it's not covered in mold like it would be in Southeast Alaska. So we felt like this was a good bet. And we found a realtor, and our realtor found us a builder who he said was a good builder. He had won lots of prizes, and he was reputedly a very good builder. And so we had a meeting with him, explained what we were after, and at this point we were more knowledgeable. And we specifically pressed him on questions. I remember specifically thinking, I want to ask him these questions in an open-ended way and hear what he has to say about his construction methods. What do you do for dry-in? How do you vapor-proof the building? How do you moisture barrier it? How do you encapsulate the crawl space? How do you manage for moisture? Do you use boards that have mold on them? And he answered all those questions satisfactorily. And then we told him what price point we were looking at, and he said, "Oh, I never built anything that cheap." And it was a total put down, but I think we didn't have the confidence to recognize it as the insult it was, because we're still putting a lot of money on the line. And so we said to him, "We don't want you to do this project unless you want to do it. Feel free to walk away." And he said he wanted to do it. So we were under contract. And in retrospect, I regret not spelling out those specific steps in contract. I think you always should. But our impression was that we weren't going to be able to make any headway with the builder who saw us being that particular. And most of what we wanted was already implied by code. And we were going to be an AHFC financed building, so it needed to be code compliant. But long story short, things went very downhill. At that time, we were living in an apartment owned by some friends of ours up here, and they had very generously offered it to us to live in for free while I was completing my chemotherapy. And I had a doctor up here who was administering my weekly low-dose metronomic chemo under my Seattle doctor's instructions, and then I reached remission within 3 months of that treatment. Tumor disappeared, and my liquid biopsies showed no fragments of the cancer. Everything was going well. And then all hell broke loose. One night I just had this bad feeling about our property based on a conversation we had with the builder. I just felt like things are off, and I need to go see our property. I need to see our build site, and I need to see the boards. And I walked over there, lifted up the corner of the tarp. They were covered in black fuzz. And that makes you feel. So we addressed that right away and said, we don't want this. We want new boards. We need boards that are 100% free of mold. And he kind of hemmed and hawed, and then finally he sent back that load of lumber and got a new one. And lo and behold, the building was thrown up just like that. And the next time we came to visit, we're like, oh, so he got rid of the old boards, and all of a sudden the framing is up. How did that happen so fast? And we didn't have a chance to look at these new boards. So we're walking around the building, and we're starting to notice these different boards in the house that have mold growing on them. There were about 7. And so we photographed them, and we wrote up a document. We were putting everything in writing. So we want these ones removed. And at that point, it just became like pulling teeth to get our builder to communicate with us. He didn't want to communicate in writing. He didn't like reading, and he wasn't good at writing. So he tried to call us. And then we would circle back by putting our phone call in writing. or we'd have his realtor summarize things because we didn't want to be off the record. And it took weeks to get some of those boards removed. And ultimately, he just refused to remove some. So at that point, we started thinking to ourselves, we have the right for a third-party inspector to come in and pull the brakes on this. So let's see if there's anybody here who knows about mold, who might be able to at least back us up on this. And through the phone tree, I called one remediation company, and they said, call this person. And they said, call this person. And they all told me to call Pat Hartshorn. And so I called Pat Hartshorn, and I was amazingly gratified and relieved because he talked on the phone for about a half hour, and he said all the things that I had been learning for the last 10 years. And he understood what standards needed to be, and he understood how serious mold was. And he was absolutely willing to go to bat for us. So we invoked that right, and we had him come over, and he inspected our build and wrote up a document and said, this is what you need to do. And this is what you need to do to save the building from becoming moldy, because there were 2 feet of snow on the subfloor. And they were just going to let it melt into the seams and then not dry it. And then the crawl space was all wet. So he gave us a detailed plan, and our builder very grudgingly agreed to abide by it, but then he did not. And so we'd come out there every day and we'd check. And then pretty soon his realtor said, you're making the subcontractors uncomfortable. You can't come here anymore without written permission. Which was, just completely false. They were making me uncomfortable. But the long and short of it is that my husband had to do the drying himself. We had to rent a machine that, would blast warm air through the crawl space and force the moisture out of the seams. That cost thousands of dollars. It cost more because our builder was supposed to keep it supplied with fuel, and he let it run out. So it was dry. It was drying for 2 days without any heat. So we had to pay for more time. And it was very weird and inimical. It was like they were actively fighting us on our efforts to dry in the building, just out of spite almost. And I can't prove that, but we would walk into the building in the middle of the dry-in, and there would have been explicit written directions, like, duct the heater into the crawl space hatch, tape it so that it's sealed, and put up a vapor barrier here. And they would not have done that. So we'd come back and say, nope, this is how it's supposed to be done. So finally we started going over there. Our realtor and my husband cut a hatch for the crawl space, and they taped everything appropriately. And my husband got vapor barrier, and he hung it up and taped it. The next day we came in, and it had been slashed down with a knife. So he taped it again and put up a sign and said, do not take this down. It is required for drying. It needs to stay for 48 hours per so-and-so. And we come back, and it was again cut down the next day, and the sign was kicked off to the side. Just that kind of thing. And my husband was flying like 12-hour days up to the North Slope. He would land after flying to Dead Horse at about 9 at night, and he'd go right over to the property, and he would spend time working on it. It was absurd. And so then at that point, and he had to sand the studs that had mold himself. We wanted to make sure it was done right. So he would get back from work in the dark, in negative temperatures. He would go over there to this cold house, and he would sand the studs, and he vacuumed out every single wall bay in that house. He was heroic for me. And it was just incredibly stressful. But we finally got that done, and we went through mediation with our realtor and his realtor and her broker, which was absolutely a joke. They totally gaslit us. But at that point, we had succeeded in getting the dry-in done. We had succeeded in getting the moldy studs out and getting them sanded down, and we felt like everything was going to be okay. And we still had Pat consulting with us, and he thought it was going to be fine. And our builder at that point was threatening to kick us off our land. And he would tell us these funny stories about other contracts he'd ripped up in front of people's faces, get out of my house, that kind of thing. And thankfully for us, he doesn't understand things as well as he thinks he does. And we had proofed our quitclaim deed against him doing that. So he wasn't able to, but I have no doubt he would have done that if we hadn't done that. So we won the house, and we closed. But before that happened, we had some other terrible things happen, and our apartment had a leak under the sink. And that was actually our fault. because we had one night allowed some water to stand on the butcher block counter. And I don't think it was sealed. It wasn't sealed against moisture, so it just swelled up and the sink popped loose on the corner. And I remember looking at it and going, "Oh, I got to tell our friends about that." But that little bit of motion jiggled the U-bend under the sink, and I don't think the U-bend was threaded. It didn't have a thread sealer, so water had been dripping out. And I remember checking under there and going, "Is there moisture leaking?" And I had done that just a few weeks before Christmas, and there was nothing down there. But it happened rapidly, and right around Christmas time, I started to notice things felt not good. And I was in the middle of, I had been through about 9 months of chemo at this point. So, how do you tell one symptom from another? But the day after Christmas, my Anchorage-based oncologist decided he was done following another oncologist's orders, and he kicked me out of his practice. And he had forgotten that I was in remission. He had not been tracking with my case. He wanted me on palliative care. So he utterly reduced me to tears, and his words were, "You just have to go back to Seattle." Just like it was very easy. And then we discovered the mold under the sink. And when we opened up the cupboard, it let out so many spores, I suddenly could not draw full breath. And I had the worst brain fog of my life. It was utterly terrifying. And I had just been talking to another young mom about mold, and I had told her how awful it was, and the words I had said were, "I will never allow my family to be put in that situation again. I will live outside if I have to." And so I'm laying face down in bed thinking, I am being tested on those very words, and it was negative 40 degrees outside. And we had nowhere to go. And I had just lost my treatment 3 months out from completion. So I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't think straight. So I just bundled the kids into the car, and I drove all the way to Palmer, and I got out in the Safeway parking lot and just breathed the freezing cold air. It took about 20 minutes for me to be able to start breathing normally again after getting out of the apartment. And I called my husband. I'm like, "This is what's going on. I don't know what to do." And I don't think I've ever been so desperate in life. It's like I've lost my medical treatment. Our house is not being built the way we wanted, and it's potentially mold compromised. We don't know if it's going to work out. We don't have housing. It's negative 40. And where on earth are we going to get the money for all this? And my husband, bless his heart, he just said, "We'll figure it out one day at a time. Just go reserve an Airbnb. We know this one we've been in before is fine. Let's just go there tonight, and we'll take it one day at a time." So we did that, and he said, "Don't go back in that apartment. I will go and get stuff from there." So I just got on my phone, and I reserved an Airbnb. My girls and I went way out to Meadow Lakes to this little tiny cabin. My husband got laundry baskets full of clothes for us and things like that, and we just started there, and we just said, "We'll take it a week at a time." And so I had to start flying back to Seattle every week. So it was just every week we had to find the new Airbnb, just about. And every week we needed to find a new way for me to be able to get down to Seattle and a new place to stay there. Because when I was in Juneau, I could get on the plane at 5 a.m, complete my chemotherapy, and get back on at night. And this time I had to get on the plane early, or I had to get on the plane in the evening, overnight in Seattle, get up early, get to chemo, and then I could get back by midnight the following night. And it was just hellish. So, but people just started coming out of the woodwork for us. People gave us donations of money. Our old church was just incredibly supportive. The people in the church we were attending at the time would give us buddy passes on the airline. Just every week it was something new. And it somehow worked out. Somehow it all panned out. And I always say, you can't really account for it, but in God's economy, it just works out. So I completed my chemo. I had some friends in Seattle who allowed me to crash at their house every week, and every week the husband would drive me into my clinic. They're my oldest childhood friends. And so we closed on our house, and I finished chemo, and we had Easter and my husband's birthday all in 1 week. And we thought we were in the clear. And for a while it was good, and things were wonderful. Just a second. Until later on that year, about 9 months after we had moved into our house, I started to notice things being a little irregular. I noticed certain places in the house Hi, Teddy.
Sorry. Yes. I don't put me on mute.
I started to notice that I was feeling short of breath in the kitchen. Um, so I asked Pat out to come and look at it, and he checked around behind the dishwasher. I was suspicious of that area because I could feel something there. And he said, "I don't see anything." And so we kind of thought maybe it's the fridge, maybe it's like old food in the fridge. But because we're paranoid, we had water alarms all over the house. We had water alarms sitting on the sill of the crawl space. We had water alarms under our sinks. We had humidity sensors in our house. We would always get an alert when we showered because the humidity would pop up really briefly in the bathroom. And then one day I was praying, if there is mold in our house, would you please show it to us? Walked to our house after church within a few hours, and water alarm in the space under the bathroom was just screeching. We dove down there, and we found that there was water pouring in through our subfloor all along the length of the house inside, and it was raining outside then. So we got Pat back over again. And at first, he thought it was just from an unsealed duct hood outside, and it had just gotten down there and was running along the seam of the floor. And then he had a sudden inspiration. He thought, "Oh, you know what? Let me check the windows areas." And so he moisture metered and he said, "Oh, shoot!" Um, and I've never consciously experienced dissociation till that moment. It was like a total out of body experience, as he explained to me that our windows were saturated with water, just the drywall on the windowsill. And so, long story short, it turned out that our builder had not put Tyvek or flashing or tape around our windows. Everything was sealed with caulk, and the caulk had been applied on cold days, so it had snapped and stretched. All of our windows on that side, I should say, the kitchen windows were leaking, and our back bedroom window was leaking, the bathroom window was leaking, and it had all come inside the walls, flowed between the layers of flooring. So we had mold around our windows in our kitchen and our bathroom and our bedroom and on the subfloor all the way down the hallway. It was a large part of the house. So we left right away, and thankfully, by God's grace, our insurance company was willing to pick up the tab. Eventually, we were paying out of pocket to stay in Airbnbs again. We were really good at this point. So, we knew how to, everybody has a laundry basket with their clothes in them. We have a laundry basket for our books and our school supplies. We have a laundry basket for our refrigerator food, and we have a laundry basket for our freezer food. And that's how we're living. And we stack those in the back of the car, and when you have to move out of one Airbnb, you just Tetris it in there, and then you go to the new place and you start all over again. But we moved out of our house within one day. We took everything out of there and we piled it in the garage, and we thought, we'll just deal with this later. And so Rapid Response came in. Ron Farnsworth and his team, they're amazing. They came in and remediated our house and did it according to IICRC standards. They did a great job. It took 3 months for us to get everything cleaned up again. We small particle cleaned our house within an inch of its life. I think we vacuumed and dusted every surface twice, and we fogged it twice. And when I say fog, I mean the Weatherman protocol, not chemically treating mold, but creating condensation nuclei in the air so that everything drops down, and then you can just wipe it up. It makes a huge difference. I'm a big believer in it. At the same time, we had our house inspected again, and we found out that the initial phase inspections had been falsified. And my husband actually called up the inspector and said, "Did you know our house doesn't have house wrap?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, but I don't think it's necessary because it does more harm than good. It traps moisture." And he said, "Well, here's what happened to our house." And there was a silence on the other end of the line. And this guy said, "Well, the builders won't work with me if I insist on house wrap and if I ding them for this. How do you expect me to feed my family?" And my husband wasn't having any of that at that point. "Do you understand that my wife is sick from this, and we have been out of our house for 3 months?" And so we followed the bond process to put in a claim on our builder's bond because he had committed gross negligence, and he was in violation of code. And we followed all the proper legal steps for that. We sent him certified mail. We gave him 30 days to respond. He never so much as reached out to us. His realtor called my husband off the record and sort of said, "Well, he's not going to agree to pay for any of this." I was like, "Okay, well, we're going to go after his bond." So we shared everything that we were finding, and we had inspection reports detailing the fact that our house had no Tyvek, no window flashing, nothing but caulk, and all the repairs that were having to get done. And let's see here. So then, thankfully, our insurance covered the cost of the remediation and putting the house back together. And they eventually covered our housing. But after that point, and then we had to take apart our house to an extent. We had to have all the windows taken out and the doors. We had Tyvek put on over the siding, and then we had additional siding put on top of that. So the house was very strong. All the mold had been removed from the inside, but at the end of the day, all the costs that we were facing were close to $80,000, not including medical care, not including the cost of goods and things that we had in our house that we had lost. We didn't even try enumerating that because we knew it would probably be a hard sell with insurance, because they don't believe in what's it called, stage 3 particulate contamination. They don't want to pay for something unless it has mold growing on it, and they don't understand that as a hypersensitive individual, if I pick up a book that's been in a moldy house, it is going to make me sick. So we had to start all over again, but we had a lot of stuff saved in our garage. And we just kind of considered our garage. We had our garage cordoned off, so we would approach it from the outside. We didn't open that door. And we gradually moved through those things, trying to clean the things that are not porous and figure out what to do with the other stuff. And then one day I was looking up above our washing machine, and I noticed this spot up there, and I don't have good eyesight. So I hopped up there and realized, oh, shoot, it is in fact a spot of mold. And maybe that's why I'm still feeling a little off in here. And the garage, of course, it gets so much airflow, it's difficult to tell. But turned out our garage had not been sealed to the house correctly. We had T111 siding, which has grooves vertically, and then the flashing had been put over the grooves. So rain was going into the grooves and pouring directly into our attic, which is utterly absurd. I don't know how stupid you have to be to do something like that, but that's what our builder did. And so we had to have remediation done all over again out there. And at the same time, I was having reconstructive surgery, finally. But at that point, we decided for ourselves, you know what? The house doesn't feel perfect anymore. And at that point, we had you come out too with Ted. And I was really impressed with him. He found all the areas that had previously had mold on them. He found pieces of furniture that we knew were compromised, just by cross-contamination. I know he's really, really sensitive, but with all the inspections we had done and being so familiar with our house and checking in a few other areas, opening up the walls, we realized I am most likely just reacting to residual cross-contamination from when mold was here. And this is not why we moved here. We didn't move here to live in a compromised house. We moved here to give me my best chance of never having cancer come back. And that's not happening in a house that's cross-contaminated for me. So we made the very difficult decision to sell our house again. And we poured tens of thousands of dollars into fixing up the damage and cleaning it. And then we had post-clearance testing done, which showed it as being a safe microbial ecology, not different from the outdoors, in other words, I think is the standard that's usually invoked, and put it on the market with copious disclosures. And we finally sold it just a few weeks ago. We took a big loss in the equity because, of course, people are scared off by disclosures, which is frustrating because I know most of the houses here do have mold, and they have active growing mold, and they are set up to continue having mold. They have poor foundations, they have poor ventilation. A lot of them, as it turns out, don't have Tyvek. But our house looked a lot worse on paper than houses which might not even have a disclosure but do have mold. But we were happy to do that because we would never want to put someone else in the position of not knowing fully what was there. So we had addenda detailing everything that happened with the house. And, we didn't want to leave anything uncovered for new buyers. We wanted it to be something they were absolutely comfortable with. But the really sad thing is that we had selected that lot to be our forever home. And it was this gorgeous place out in old farmland. We had an amazing garden. We had 4 feet of topsoil. We had incredible neighbors. I would absolutely trust them to have my daughter over there every day. It was a good place for my kids to grow up. It was a good place to grow old. And that was taken from us. All to save about $700 in tieback and labor. So here we are, starting over again. And, we keep saying third time's the charm. And I'm hoping that this time we'll be successful in pulling off a new build. But we know so much more now. What we do want to do is we want to steer away from ever having wall cavities ever again. We don't want to have a crawl space ever again. We're going to do slab on grade. We're going to grade our yard properly. We want to have cedar walls. We're going to have hopefully solid cedar walls. And that is important to us because I grew up in a cedar cabin. And my solid cedar cabin that my parents own is still a safe place for me in a rainforest. So I'm a big believer in that. But we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about properly vetting your professionals. We've learned a lot about the process of dealing with this. And we've learned about where Alaska law falls short in protecting people. And unfortunately, we have uncovered some shady dealings between house inspectors and builders and professional associations. We complained to everybody we possibly could about our builder and the inspector. We complained to state licensing, and they basically just filed it and kept them in good standing. We complained to his professional homebuilders association, and they gave him the chance to respond, and he didn't respond within their timeline, so they put a negative mark on his record, but they still accepted his side of the story when he did eventually leave them a voicemail that was just full of lies and blamed us. So, we challenged them on that. Like, how are you protecting consumers if you are letting somebody like this continue to build with a good reputation? They actually gave him a prize after that. And they didn't have an answer for me. We eventually did go public with our story. We shared a bad review of him online after we were positive that, we weren't going to affect anything legally by saying things publicly. And I hope that people will look at that and realize it's a bad thing to work with him. But the state of Alaska is woefully behind where it comes to mold. And I know that you can speak to this too, Jennifer. But from my experience, I look at it and I realize, protections for renters, requirements of the building industry and inspection industry, so many different things, and just our ability to recognize mold as a hazard. I firmly believe mold is a greater hazard to human health than asbestos or lead, because for those, you actually have to disturb them. You have to disturb them and inhale or ingest them. Mold hurts you just by being there. And it's not easy to deal with. You can't just get rid of a popcorn ceiling and you're good. You can't just remove the paint and paint over it and you're good. It takes huge, expensive, heroic efforts to get rid of mold. And even then, it's not usually enough for those of us who are sensitive. It's a dirty little corner of the world, the insurance industry and the building industry and the inspection industry and the neglect from the medical system. And I don't really expect that to change anytime soon, but I'm here saying my bit. And I've been encouraged just in the last 10 years by how much the field has changed and how much more knowledgeable people are.
Yeah. Well, I cannot thank you enough. And you have to know that you brought tears to my eyes a couple times. Your story of, just pressing on. I didn't know your whole story, and there's just so much adversity that you guys have overcome. But like you said, you just keep trudging on, giving it to God. He keeps working it out. There's a couple of things I wanted to address because there's so much meat in your story. One thing is I want to address the bleach first, because I literally had a guy 38 years remediating and doing plumbing in Alaska. And if you've got a water leak, you need to immediately put bleach on it. And I was just like,
oh my goodness, all the same thing. No, Jennifer, you are a force of nature, and we are very lucky to have you here, because I know you're just getting started. And one of the amazing things about this whole experience, as awful as it's been, is how it has enabled me to connect with people in a different way. Because people come to you, and usually it takes a couple times. People will say, oh, well, haha, I've got mold in my house. What can I spray it with? Because I know you know about this. So you can't just spray it with something. And we don't know what to do until you look into it further. And usually nobody's ready to hear that right off the bat. It takes them going back and trying their cheap methods and then getting sicker and realizing it's not taking care of it until they're really ready to look it in the face, unfortunately. And I get it because that's what we did too. It's a big investment, but especially for husbands, I think it's difficult because more often they're the breadwinner and they're cognizant of the financial impact of all this. But we have to ask ourselves ultimately, what is the worst that could happen in either case? If the mold is not a big deal, well, you move out of your house and you lose your stuff. And so what? It's just stuff. And that is something I and my family have become, I think, so aware of that. It's just stuff. You're not going to die if you give up, even your books. I thought losing my books was going to be the hardest thing. Losing old handwritten letters from my grandparents, that was the hardest. And I do wish I'd handled that differently. But what's the worst thing that can happen on the other side? Your wife could get cancer. Your kids could get cancer. And one thing that is also important to realize about this is so many of the problems that we take for granted now are actually due to mold. Why is cancer so prevalent? Why are neurodevelopmental problems so prevalent? Why are miscarriages so prevalent? And yes, these things have always been happening, but mold is a causative factor for many of these things. And I hate it when people will say, oh, there's no known link to cancer from mold. No, the articles, the clinical studies haven't come out and said, yes, mold causes this percentage of cancer cases. But what are the labs that you look at in cases of SIRS? TGF-beta, MSH, MMP9, IGF-1, galectin-3. Guess what the cancer terrain labs are? TGF-beta, MSH, MMP9, IGF-1, galectin-3, and I could go on and on. Mold sets up the microenvironment for cancer to thrive. There is no breast cancer in my family. There is almost no cancer in my family. I don't have the BRCA gene. There is no reason for me to have cancer except for that moldy apartment.
This is Alaska Mold Stories, because sometimes healing begins when someone finally believes your story. With your hostess, Jennifer Kindred. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay well.